Oke, ya selamat siang menuju sore. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, namo budaya, Om Swastiastu, dan salam kebajikan. Ya, pada kesempatan kali ini kita akan melakukan public lecture ya yang berjudul The Afterlives of a Shipwreck. Bersama kita di sini ada Bu Natali Pearson. Halo, how are you? Oke. Okay. Okay, thank you. Yeah, before we start uh, this discussion, we would like opening remarks from Pak Herry as a chairman of research organization for archaeology, language, and literature. Time is yours, Pak Herry.
Oke, terima kasih kepada Pak Alqiz sebagai pewawancara. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan dan rahayu. Yang saya hormati Pak Marlon sebagai Kepala Pusat Riset Arkeologi Lingkungan Maritim dan Budaya Berkelanjutan. Also kepada Dr. Natali Pearson yang akan menjadi pembicara dalam public lecture. Maybe I will speak campur-campur karena Pak Ibu Natali juga menguasai bahasa Indonesia dengan baik, tapi tidak untuk presentasi ini katanya. Jadi selamat datang di sekarang namanya adalah kawasan Sain RP Suyono ya. Dulunya gedung Puslit Arkenas ya. Dan juga selamat datang, welcome to Ibu Natali Pearson yang akan memberikan public lecture dengan judul Life After a Shipwreck ya. Jadi apa bahasa Indonesianya? Hidup setelah kehidupan setelah kapal yang karam. Nah, seperti itu ya. Ya, saya kira I think this lecture is also in time because I think in BRIN, especially in Riset Organization of Arkeologi Lingkungan and Literature, we have one research center, namely Arkeologi Lingkungan Maritim dan Budaya Berkelanjutan. Yeah. Maybe quite stranger name, Archaeology, Environment, Maritime, and Sustainable Culture. And then I think in one of research group, namely Arkeologi Maritim, yeah. And I talked with Pak Marlon earlier about the, let's say, just like history of research related with the shipwreck. Actually, it starts from like 1980s, yeah, in Arkenas at the time. And I think this is the one of important research topic, and also maybe in the view of policy is also very important, because I think colleague from KKP, the Ministry of Maritime and Fisheries, something like that, maybe they have a very, very rich data about the area of shipwreck, maybe during the World War II and in another age. I think that's why I think that's very important, this lecture, and also for our research organization. And actually this is very short notice, yeah, only 2 or 3 days. And Ibu Natali say yes to give us a lecture. And then if we talk about public lecture, actually we are waiting for get inspiration about the lecture. Maybe we can get the research question or experience from Ibu Natali about this research. And of course, from us, from BRIN, we would like to have the collaboration with Natali for the future, to collaborate research related with these issues, using different scheme in BRIN. let's say, just like we have also research collaboration, we have scheme visiting researcher, postdoc, maybe if you have junior staff to do research together with us. I think that's all for me. That's all important about this public lecture is we would like to have new inspiration about this issue. Thank you. Selamat sore and enjoy discussion. Thank you.
Oke. Ya, terima kasih Pak Herry atas sambutannya untuk memulai diskusi ini. Dan mohon maaf sebelumnya saya belum pernah memimpin acara diskusi secara formal, jadi mungkin kita rileks saja ya. Mohon maaf Pak Herry, Pak Marlon, Bu Natali, kita ngobrol-ngobrol saja di sini. Okay, before we start the lecture, I would like to introduce Dr. Natali Pearson. I have a short bio here. Dr. Natali Pearson is a curriculum coordinator at the Sidney Southeast Asia Center, the University of Sydney, where she is also affiliated with the School of Humanities. Her research focuses on underwater cultural heritage in Southeast Asia, and she is the president of the Indonesian Council also. Currently she just published her first book entitled Maritim, The Afterlives of a Shipwreck. That's also we cited as the title for this lecture as well. Okay, that's my short introduction about Dr. Natali Pearson. So we would like to start the lecture, and Dr. Natali, the time is yours.
Check. Yeah, okay. Ini bisa. Ya, baik. Oke, terima kasih. Selamat sore semua. Nama saya Natali Pearson. Salam kenal. Saya dari Universitas Sydney dan saya senang sekali di sini di BRIN dan saya mau berterima kasih banyak atas Pak Marlon dan Pak Herry untuk undangan ini. Ya, saya senang sekali. Ya, buku baru yang ditulis, saya akan bicara tentang buku yang baru ini, namanya Belitung, Kehidupan Setelah Mati Kapal Yang Tenggelam, The Afterlives of a Shipwreck. Mungkin kita bisa mulai dengan PowerPoint. Bisa bagi layar ya? Coba sebentar. Oke, baik. Bisa presenter view? Ya, belum jalan. Ini oke? Ini oke? Baik. It's okay? Might hit display settings. Yeah. Tunggu sebentar ya. Selalu ada masalah teknologi. Ya, baik. Terima kasih. Okay. So, walaupun saya bisa mengerti bahasa Indonesia, saya masih malu berbicara bahasa Indonesia, jadi saya akan pakai bahasa Inggris kalau boleh. Terima kasih. Kalau pakai bahasa Indonesia, pasti jalan ya sepanjang sore. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So, there are an estimated 3 million shipwrecks in the world. So today I'm going to tell you about the life and the afterlife of just one of these 3 million ancient shipwrecks, the Belitung. And every shipwreck has a story to tell. This one, for me, is especially intriguing because of the threat that it poses to institutional approaches. This shipwreck and its commercially salvaged cargo have come to represent some of the most contested and controversial domains in the display of underwater cultural heritage. The Belitung shipwreck subverts the international scientific standards established by the 2001 UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage. And this international convention firmly opposes any form of commercial exploitation. So the interesting thing about the Belitung shipwreck is that it was not managed the way it should have, according to the convention. And yet we have a largely intact assemblage of objects that have been salvaged, conserved and displayed, and which can be accessed by the public and by scholars. So the question of how we reconcile this tension is the question that my book tries to address, and I will explore this question in my talk today. Next slide, please. I do this by taking a biographical approach to the objects, tracing their lives and their afterlives, and thinking about the changes they have undergone and the changes they have affected. The wreck was part of a connected world, as you can see in this map. Now, it's not very high resolution. It's a bit difficult to see all the names and the places, but what it does give you is a sense of how many different places the ship, its cargo, and the people it connects, both temporally across time and spatially across different geographies of land and ocean. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to tell you about the discovery and the recovery of the shipwreck here in Indonesia in the late 1990s, which was a time of great social and political upheaval. Next, I'll introduce you to the objects themselves, and you will start to develop a sense of their connections with the ancient world, of the demand for these Chinese ceramics in the Middle East in the 9th century, and get a sense of the people who played such an important role in this transoceanic trade. I'll also talk about the ship. So it's commonly assumed that this ship was from Oman. I don't think that is correct, but it is interesting to see why that Omani origin story still prevails and what this says about who can lay claim to heritage. Finally, I'll look at what happened to the objects after they were salvaged, and in particular the controversies and ethical considerations associated with their sale and display. Next slide, please. So we'll begin here in Belitung Island, the tropical waters of, next slide, sorry. Here we have the famous Batu Hitam, the black rocks of Belitung Island. And this is where much of the story takes place. So it was the mid-1990s when the ship first came to the attention of the salvagers. And Indonesia had introduced fairly recently legislation that permitted commercial operators to apply for survey permits and salvage permits to hunt for shipwrecks. And for the objects or the profits from the sale of those objects to be shared 50-50 with the Indonesian government. Salvage companies had to pay for their own costs and the licenses were not cheap, but if you found a shipwreck, there was money to be made. And in fact, just a few years earlier, thousands of pieces of blue and white ceramics from the Geldermalsen had been sold for millions of pounds at auction in the Netherlands. There was a real premium on Chinese ceramics from the sea, and it was the sale of the Geldermalsen objects that prompted Indonesia to introduce its commercial salvage legislation in 1989. So it was within this context that Tilman Walterfang set up a company called Seabed Explorations here in Indonesia. and began looking for shipwrecks in the waters off Belitung Island. And to do so, they used the help of local fishing communities who are usually the first to know the whereabouts of a shipwreck. So if we go to the next slide now, I'm speaking with an Indonesian audience, so of course you are familiar with Belitung Island, but I like to use this map for people who are not familiar with Indonesia so that they can get a sense of where Belitung Island lies in relation to bigger islands of Java, Sumatra and Borneo. On this map, you can see some other names of shipwrecks. You can see the Cirebon, north of Java, the Intan shipwreck, just to the east of Sumatra, the Bakau shipwreck, and of course, Belitung. Now, seabed explorations had found the Intan and had salvaged the Intan, and they were working on the Bakau shipwreck when news started to come through of a new site. In fact, the news was that there was a reef where jars were growing, a really evocative phrase used by one of the local fishers. Next slide, please. So here it is, the reef where jars grow. This is a beautiful photo by Michael Flecker. So the site, the Belitung shipwreck site, was about 2 miles offshore and about 50 feet down. So it was quite accessible. It was about 17 to 20 meters underwater. You didn't need to be a scientific diver to access this site. So the fishers had been searching for trepang, but instead they had been pulling up Tang Dynasty ceramics, which dates it to the 9th century. And the ceramics were in very good condition. So there's a wonderful story of a curator called John Guy, who worked at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And the salvage company sent him one of these ceramics that they had salvaged from the sea. And he said he didn't believe it came from the sea because it was so lustrous. Its glaze was as if it had just been made. It certainly did not look like it had been underwater for 1,000 years. Next slide, please. Now, as many of you might recall, this was a very turbulent period in Indonesian history. The financial crisis of 1997 was followed by the fall of Suharto in 1998. And there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment, particularly in Jakarta. But the reason I mention this is because there was not a great deal of interest in Chinese ceramics coming from the sea. Indonesia had much bigger priorities in 1998 and wasn't, particularly concerned with what happened to this particular shipwreck. So we'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So we have this underwater site off Belitung Island with the 9th century ceramics scattered across the seabed. And we have this commercial salvage company, Seabed Explorations, looking for shipwrecks. Next slide, please. So they applied for a survey and salvage permit, and the first salvage season starts in late 1998. This is what it looks like during the work. The dive boat and the ceramics concreted together on the seabed. And for maritime archaeologists, these assemblages and the way they are formed can reveal key information about the site. But the site has to be excavated carefully, methodically, scientifically. And I'm using these terms quite carefully. So excavation is different from salvage. Salvage connotes expediency, and data collection might be haphazard if it happens at all. So as part of the permit system in Indonesia in the 1990s, there was a requirement that sites had to be excavated and data had to be collected. But in practice, this was not enforced or monitored. Next slide, please. So they start pulling dozens and then hundreds and then thousands of objects out of the water. And most of them are these bowls from the kilns of Changsha in China. Michael Flecker estimates that there were 70,000 objects on the ship when it sank, and most of them, over 65,000, were these bowls from Changsha. So they were packed in stacks, as you can see in this image. They were also coiled inside large storage jars. Next slide, please. As you can see in this photo. And the ones in the storage jars were particularly well preserved because they had been protected by layers of organic bubble wrap like mung beans or straw. So next slide, please. They're brought to the surface in these plastic containers and then they're rinsed on board before being brought back to base on Belitung Island. Next slide, please. But the number of objects coming out of the ocean really starts to become a problem. There was very limited data collection going on during this first salvage season, and there were no maritime archaeologists on the team at that time, and there was a lot of pressure to wrap up the recovery within just a few weeks. The monsoon season was approaching, and this would have made it very difficult to dive the site. So what this meant is if they did not finish the salvage before the monsoon, they would have to stop work. And that ran the risk of exposing the site to looting. So there were so many objects that they were not able to complete the salvage before the monsoon arrived. And during the monsoon, there was Indonesian police and Navy boats stationed above the site to protect it, but it's not clear how effective that was. And there is a possibility that, the site was looted during that pause in the monsoon. Next slide, please. So Tilman Walterfang, who we see on the right here, the Director of Seabed Explorations, used the pause in operations to recruit a new member of staff, and that was Australian diver Michael Flecker on the left. And it was Flecker who oversaw the second salvage season, which took place in 1999. There was concretion at the time on the seabed of the objects, so not all of the objects were salvaged. And although there was an estimated 70,000 objects on board, only 60,000 were actually salvaged. And the hull was not recovered. This was a condition of the Indonesian salvage permit, that the hull be left in situ, with the plan that it would be developed into a tourist diving site. Okay, next slide, please. Let's take a closer look at the objects themselves. So we'll go next slide. Thank you. This map shows the kilns in China that produced the ceramics found in the cargo, and the size of the circles is relative to the quantity of objects found in the cargo. So what this map tells us is that a lot of the ceramics came from Changsha, and Changsha is really interesting because it is inland. So we need to think about how the objects, these heavy, breakable, valuable objects, were transported to a place where they could be loaded on a ship, and think about the network of canals and rivers and the packing techniques, the many people involved in getting the objects from the kilns inland to a place where they could be put onto the ship. The second thing I would like to point out is that there was a diversity of kilns. So even though most of them came from Changsha, we can also see that some ceramics came from Gongxian, from Guangzhou, from Ding and Xing in the north, etc. So what I want you to see when you look at this map and take away is that there was a really well integrated network of people, merchants, producers, clients, seafarers, and they were working together to coordinate these large orders of products that were then transported vast distances across the oceans at considerable risk and expense, but with considerable profit to be made if the journey was successful. Next slide, please. So let's look at these objects from Changsha. Of the 60,000 pieces that were recovered, about 57,500 were ceramics from Changsha. So these potters from Changsha specialized in everyday vessels. They were very practical. So they were making things like bowls and jars and ewers. So of the 57,500 Changsha ceramics that were recovered, about 55,000 were the bowls that you can see on your screen. And they're quite small. They're about 15 centimeters or 6 inches wide. And they were very popular trade goods. And I'm sure my friends in the room would know that pieces like this have been found in archaeological excavations in Indonesia, in Java, and also in the Middle East. Next slide, please. This is a picture of a curly-headed man. He's got a large nose, and it's believed to be the face of a foreigner from Central or West Asia. Next slide, please. So National Geographic described the bowls as the tongue equivalent of fiesta ware. And what they're trying to say here is that these are simple and functional and mass-produced. And when I visited these objects on display, the museum volunteer described them as a floating IKEA. So the point is that the bowls were made to order, but the market was not in China. So archaeological data from China indicates that the bowls didn't have much domestic appeal. These were made for export. And some scholars have pointed to the presence of a large Arab and Persian diaspora in Yangzhou, a port city on the Yangtze River. And this diaspora, it was a large community of Middle Easterners who lived and worked in China and were perfectly positioned to commission orders of this magnitude. They knew what the Middle Eastern market wanted. They were based in China. They could observe production, and they really played a pivotal role in what scholar Andrew Chittick describes as the economic logic that propelled ceramic innovation in the Tang period. So here we can see some motifs that appear quite frequently: mountains, landscapes, clouds, animals. Some designs appear less often, so we do see the occasional Buddhist stupa, swastikas, banners, a poem, and sea monsters. So next slide, I think. Yeah, thank you. Oh, actually go back. I just want to mention before I move on to talking about the other ceramics that recent research on the bowls has shown that they're not just clouds and nature motifs. Brushstroke analysis has revealed the presence of calligraphy in these designs, and it's thought that these are examples of pseudoscript, which was a popular feature of ceramics in the Abbasid Empire in the 9th century. So the idea is that Allah is present, but hidden in misty mountains and clouds of vapor. So this is another data point that tells us that these objects were designed for the Middle Eastern market. And I think it's important to draw attention to the fact that this sort of research is only possible because scholars have access to the whole assemblage. They can compare 55,000 bowls. Okay, let's move on to the next slide and talk about the ceramics that came from the kilns of Gongxian just to the north. Now, this was a center of experimentation, and it was known for producing ceramics that were very playful and unusual. And I don't want to have favorites, but I do love these ceramics. So let's have a look at some of them. This is green splashed stoneware. It wasn't very popular in China, except for tomb furnishings. So it was used for burials and for funerals, but it was popular in the Middle East. And we see this absolutely beautiful 1 meter decorative ewer with Middle Eastern motifs, with the lozenges on the base and the floral decoration around the body of the ewer. This has been described as a ceramic tour de force. So just a most incredible piece that, to be honest, would be difficult to make today. And this was produced in the 9th century, and you can see that its form is actually based on metal objects. You can see the upturned rim of the base and the thinness of the handle, designed to sort of mirror metal objects, but not functional, purely decorative. And it is often displayed with this, next slide please, this beautiful dragon head stopper. We don't know if this is the right stopper for the ewer, but they are usually displayed together. Now we will go to the next slide, and I'll share with you my favorite sustainable cups. This is like the original takeaway cup. So these are stem cups, and they have a built-in straw on the side. And at the bottom of the cup, the hole where the stem attaches to is covered by one of these charming little animals, a fish, a duck. There's also a turtle, I think. And so the tube works like a straw. And these green and white splashed wares were among the finest ceramics in the world at that time. Next slide, please. Now, this is really exciting example of 3 blue and white dishes or vessels found on the shipwreck. These were made in Gongxian. And what is interesting is, first of all, their age, and second, what they're made of. So before their discovery, it was commonly thought that blue and white ceramic production began in China in Jingdezhen in the 14th century. But these blue and white vessels predate that by 5 centuries. So the white finish of the vessel indicates that they are made in Gongxian, but the cobalt used for the blue glaze would have been sourced in the Middle East, around Iran. And the lozenge motif you see in the middle is also Iranian. So again, this indicates that they were tailored to Middle Eastern tastes. Next slide, please. So scholar Geraldine Hung describes these vessels as part of a story of circular desire and innovation between China and the Middle East. So we have experiments taking place on both sides, depending on the resources, skills, and materials available to them. These are like prototypes traveling in a ship across the world, and really very special objects. I've put another picture on the screen on the right. That's actually from a different collection. It's not from the Belitung shipwreck, but it's an interesting typology point of comparison. So what the Changsha ceramics and the Gongxian ceramics tell us is that the ship had connections with the Muslim world, both in terms of the merchants in China commissioning the objects and also in terms of where their intended market was. So let me just show you some of the other objects that were found on the wreck without going into too much detail. First of all, from the kilns of Ding and Xing in the north. Next slide, this porcelaneous white stoneware described as being like silver and snow. These were rare, extremely desirable, and very difficult to produce because they required the ability to fire at above 1,300 degrees Celsius for a long time. And the knowledge and the resources required to achieve that level of heat was something only China was doing in a consistent way at the time. Next, we have from Yue, the green stoneware. Yes, next slide. Often known as celadon. Whereas the whiteware was described as silver and snow, this green stoneware was compared with jade, not just because of the green color, but when you tap it, it rings like the jade stone rings. Very, very beautiful and highly desirable. Only a few hundred of these were found in the shipwreck. Now, next slide is really spectacular piece of gold. And this is oversized. It has 8 sides. It's octagonal. You can possibly see that there are some decorations on the side on each of the 8 sides. There's a dancer and 7 musicians playing instruments from Central Asia. And on top of the cup, where you hold your thumb, just go to the next slide, you can see these 2 bearded men. So really a spectacular piece, and I believe that nothing like this has been found underwater or outside China. They've only been found in tomb sites in China, so very special piece. There were some other objects of gold. I put this one here because it has the example of the swastika that you also see on the Changsha bowls. There was some silver, so we'll go to the next slide. Now, silver doesn't do very well underwater in salty water for a long time. So this silver flask took many, many thousands of dollars and many months to conserve, to bring it back to a state where we can actually see the pair of mandarin ducks on the side. Next slide, please. Some more beautiful examples of silver. Beautifully produced and also beautifully conserved, quite incredible. Next, we have the coins. Several hundred, I think, coins were found on the wreck. Maybe not even that many, but they were very helpful in dating the wreck, which we believe sank around 826 AD based on radiocarbon analysis that has been conducted and comparing that information with the coins and other data points on the wreck. Next slide. There were also some mirrors, about a dozen mirrors, and one of the mirrors actually dates from the Han Dynasty, which dates to 200 BC. So that mirror was already an antique when the shipwreck, when the ship set sail. Next slide. This is always very interesting for people who are not familiar with maritime archaeology, that organic material can survive for so long underwater in salty conditions. So we have star anise on the left. There was amber, aromatic resin from Sumatra, nuts, seeds. Now, the one thing that was not found on the wreck was fabric. So we don't know what the sails looked like. We don't know if they were square or triangular. And we also don't have any evidence of silk being in the cargo. So even though the shipwreck is often referred to as part of the Maritime Silk Road, we don't know if there was silk on board or not, or if it simply did not survive the conditions underwater. Okay, so we're going to go on now to look at a different part of the cargo. So I've been telling you about the commercial assemblage. These are the trade objects. But what I want to do now is to talk about the domestic assemblage. This is a phrase from maritime archaeologist George Bass. He talks about the domestic assemblage as a more permanent and accurate reflection of the origins of the people who were on the ship at the time, and possibly can tell us more about where the ship itself came from. So what does the Belutung's domestic assemblage tell us? Next slide, thank you. Well, it includes objects from all over the world, objects from China, objects from Southeast Asia and the Middle East. And these provide a clue as to what life was like on board. Now, I should mention that the ship didn't really have very comfortable conditions for sailing, and the crew would have lived on deck. The hull was full of the objects, and there were probably bamboo mats or something rolled out on top of the cargo, and the crew lived on the deck on top of those bamboo mats. So not a lot of protection, not a lot of shelter, and certainly no privacy. We can see this beautiful dog figurine. This was probably a personal keepsake. We can see this bone die. This is the earliest bone die ever found on a shipwreck, and 4 ivory game pieces in the shape of acorns at the bottom right, which tell us about long days spent at sea and perhaps playing games to pass the time when conditions were good and when they didn't have to work. Now, there are also many objects from China in the domestic assemblage. The one that's really interesting to me is this inkstone on the bottom left. It's engraved with an insect, and it almost certainly belonged to somebody who was literate, who needed ink to write. And this is a really curious concept because there probably were not very good conditions for writing on board this ship. So who was this person carrying the Chinese inkstone? Was it a passenger or was it a crew member? The other thing is this gold bracelet, which was broken and had been fixed. So it was not an item of trade. We believe this was a personal object. Certainly it wasn't in condition to be traded. So lots of clues here, and we don't have answers to all these questions. I also want to point out the bronze needle at the top, which for me tells us about work. It was probably used for repairs, maybe including the sails. Now, there were also objects from Southeast Asia, such as these items associated with measuring weights and scales. So probably from Java or Sumatra, we have this scale bar, the hook for a hanging scale, and scale weights. Now, there were only 4 pieces from the Middle East. You can see the 3 turquoise glazed amphora and the little very beautiful little blue glass bottle. These were probably used for storing liquids, so the amphora might have been used for storing date syrup or water, and they have been found throughout Asia, including in the Bujang Valley in Malaysia and also in China. And the glass jar is very small, might have been used for medicine or cosmetics. Next slide, thank you. So this unique cargo, consisting of the commercial objects and the domestic objects, really begs the question of where the ship came from. So next slide, thank you. The vessel itself was a real engineering marvel, capable of sailing across the ocean's waves, harnessing the monsoon winds and transporting huge quantities of goods. So even though its timbers had been submerged for over 1,000 years and the site had been quite disturbed during the first salvage season, there was still enough information for Michael Flecker to determine when he was working on the ship on the second salvage season that this was not a Chinese ship. No nails or dowels had been used in its construction, and in fact it was a stitched hull ship. So these techniques suggested that the Belitung was either built in the Western Indian Ocean or by shipwrights based elsewhere, but skilled and trained in these sewn plank boat building techniques. So this made it the first sewn plank vessel to be discovered in the Greater Indian Ocean. Next slide, thank you. So to further pinpoint the likely origin of the Belitung, the researchers looked more closely at the timber. Now, many of the timbers on the Belitung site were so degraded that it was almost impossible to look at them under a microscope, and it made it very difficult to identify where they were from. So the first round of timber analysis suggested that all the timber was from India. Then a second round of timber analysis said almost all of the samples came from outside of India. So this was really inconclusive analysis. And what it did is it added weight to the conclusion that the Belitung was constructed possibly in the region of Oman or Yemen. And I'm quoting for an article by Michael Flecker, who said it was possibly Oman or Yemen, because good boat building timbers are hard to find in these regions compared with India. Now, it's worth mentioning that there is still disagreement about the timber analysis. And there's also the question of where the wadding and the cordage come from. So the material used to sew the ship together. Some scholars actually say we can't rule out the possibility that the vessel was made in India, maybe on the East Coast, or perhaps even in Malaysia, or perhaps even in Sumatra. I would love to know the answer to these questions. So then why do we hear it referred to as an Omani ship still? Well, quite simply, it is because of Oman's support for the construction of a contemporary replica of the Belitung, which we can see here on the coast of Oman in 2008. Next slide, thank you. Oman is highly invested in upholding its maritime traditions through archaeological reconstructions. It funded an experimental archaeological reconstruction using Michael Flecker's data and analysis, and funded the building of this vessel known as the Jewel of Muscat. So in doing so, Oman really claimed the Belitung as its own. So the construction took over a year, plus sea trials and final adjustments. And the entire process was extensively documented. I highly recommend looking at the website that I cite on this slide, jewelofmuscat.tv, which has many videos and fascinating information about the construction process, which, for example, noted that the final vessel had 37,371 holes, and they had to use 1,300 coconuts, and there were over 132,000 stitches in the planking alone. Next slide. So the Jewel of Muscat was finished in 2010, and it sailed to Singapore as a gift from the government of Oman to the government of Singapore in celebration of bilateral relationship anniversary. Now, this is actually the Jewel of Muscat, and you can see it's in a building. Now, given a working ship to a government is a nice idea, but it really needs people to fund and care for its ongoing care. And these are big objects. They need to be looked after and they need to be stored somewhere. So at the moment, the Jewel of Muscat is inside the Maritime Experiential Museum on Sentosa Island in Singapore. And to get it out of this museum, you would have to take the roof off the museum. So really, I'm not sure what the fate of this ship is going to be, but it was a gift that also brought with it a burden in terms of caring and storing the Jewel of Muscat. So moving on, next slide, thank you. I just wanted to mention this other shipwreck found in Thailand, which colleagues may be aware of, the Panom Surin shipwreck. Now, this is often described as the sister ship of Belitung. It's a little bit bigger. It dates from the same time period, 9th or 10th century. And it was found about 8 kilometres inland, south of Bangkok, in, I think, a shrimp farm. And my colleagues in Thailand are doing really fantastic work on this shipwreck. And what they found is when they analysed the timber and the other organic materials, is that everything on this shipwreck is from Southeast Asia. So this is really, it raises many questions because it is constructed in exactly the same way as Belitung, but everything is from Southeast Asia. So it's really tantalizing. It really makes us think about where Belitung might have been constructed. In the meantime, however, it is Oman that has claimed the origin narrative, not because there is conclusive evidence like there is with Panom Surin, but really because they have the money to fund the replica. So by the time the Jewel of Muscat was finished and sailed to Singapore in 2010, the Belitung objects had been sold by the salvage company for $32 million. So let's return to those objects now and to their sale and display. Thank you. Next slide, thank you. So under the conditions of the salvage permit issued by Indonesia, the salvage company had to split them 50-50 with the Indonesian government, but that didn't happen with Belitung. Now, instead, the Indonesian government agreed to do a deal where the salvage company kept all of the Belitung objects and the Indonesian government kept all of the objects recovered from Intan, the Intan shipwreck, as well as a $2 million cash payment. Now, the Intan shipwreck is on display at the Museum Seni Rupa dan Keramik in Jakarta. But the point here is that the Indonesian legislation was quite flexible at the time, and it meant that the salvage company was able to keep the objects together rather than splitting them up. So they sold it as a mostly intact assemblage to Singapore for $32 million. Now, Singapore, we see Singapore City here, had no claim to the objects at all. Oman had at least been mentioned as a possible place of construction, but Singapore was really not part of the Belitung story at all. What it did have was big ambitions to develop its cultural sector as part of a push to drive tourism and investment and economic growth and to make it, you know, a global city within Southeast Asia. So part of this strategy involved the construction of a new public maritime museum. And of course, you need objects to put in museums. They need to be filled up. And then the Belitung objects came onto the market. So there were other countries interested in purchasing them. The two most notable ones are Qatar and China. But in the end, it was Singapore that got them. So this is where the problems really begin. So Singapore had purchased this significant collection of shipwrecked objects. It had spent a lot of money on them, the taxpayer money, and they needed to be looked after and, you know, they need to be conserved and curated and put on display to the Singaporean public and to the world. Singapore needed to find a story for the objects, something to justify their purchase, and something that helped them show that Singapore is the centre of Southeast Asian maritime histories and part of this bigger Silk Road story. Singapore had big ambitions. It planned an international travelling exhibition and wanted to tour the objects around the world, in the process confirming its own role within these Pan-Asian histories. So it launches a major exhibition in partnership with the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. And the exhibition is called Shipwrecked, Tongue Treasures and Monsoon Winds. And this is the catalogue, a picture of the catalogue that I'm showing here. So it's a really beautiful catalogue. It has colour pictures, scholarly essays. It's really significant catalogue and a significant partnership. So Shipwrecked opens in Singapore in 2011, and from there it's scheduled to go to Washington for its American debut. But just 5 months before it was due to open, the exhibition was due to open at the Smithsonian, it gets cancelled. And this is very short notice for an exhibition. Usually exhibitions take 3 to 5 years to plan. So for America to cancel the exhibition just 5 months before it opened was a big shock for Singapore. Next slide, please. And what had happened was there was a wave of criticism from maritime archaeologists in America. And the criticism was directed at the method of recovery. The Bluetongue shipwreck was salvaged unscientifically by commercially motivated treasure hunters. So even though it was technically legal, it was not ethical, and it blurred the distinction between genuine maritime archaeology and treasure hunting. Now, it wasn't recovered in accordance with the 2001 UNESCO Convention, even though that convention had not existed when Bluetongue was salvaged in 1998. And indeed, none of the countries involved have signed that convention. Indonesia is not a signatory, America is not a signatory, and Singapore is not a signatory. So instead, the Smithsonian announced that they were going to re-excavate the site and find out all the information the salvagers had missed. Now, the problem I have with this is that it was not based on any research partnerships or collaboration in Indonesia. And I've been talking a lot the last few days with my Indonesian colleagues about how important these research partnerships and collaborations are. The Smithsonian's announcement betrayed a lack of understanding of the Indonesian context, in which Indonesia was grappling with the question of how to manage the thousands of shipwrecks in its waters. At a time in the late 1990s when capacity for maritime archaeology was extremely limited. More importantly, the statement overlooks the fact that the site had already been re-excavated by Indonesian archaeologists from Jambi just a year earlier in 2010. Now, maritime archaeological excavations are time-consuming and expensive. So what are the alternatives to these resource-heavy excavations? And if there are no alternatives, what are the implications for the 3 million ancient shipwrecks in the ocean? Next slide, please. So the cancellation was a museological problem for Singapore. They had committed so much financial and cultural capital to the project and really could not afford for it to fail. If its curatorial partner was not willing to display the objects, what future did this international travelling exhibition have? Should, as some archaeologists argue, the objects just be returned to the ocean floor as a disincentive for treasure hunters and commercial salvagers? Or was it possible to develop an exhibition of these objects that both disavowed looting while ensuring the public's right to learn from and about the world's underwater cultural heritage? Singapore was also up against another challenge, the lack of knowledge of and engagement with Southeast Asia in the global cultural heritage sector. I think it's really telling that the coordination and energy mustered by the anti-shipwrecked campaigners did not lead to efforts to share knowledge or build institutional links or develop capacity building programs with Southeast Asian colleagues. So for me, there's no doubt that the criticism levelled at Shipwrecked was justified, especially its failure to address ethical concerns regarding underwater cultural heritage management. But in their opposition to the exhibition, the critics silenced the voices of those who had valid questions about the practical realities of protecting and preserving underwater cultural heritage in Indonesia. So since then, Singapore has charted a steady course in recovering from this big controversy. The objects have found their forever home. Next slide, thank you. Not in a new public maritime museum, which was never built, but here at the Asian Civilizations Museum, where they were put on permanent display in 2015. And we have these really beautiful curatorial techniques where you can see the wave of Changsha bowls and the mini replica ship floating on the wave of bowls. Because there are so many objects, Singapore can afford to have a permanent display in the Asian Civilizations Museum and also to have international travelling exhibitions. And each international travelling exhibition has emphasised a different part of the story. If you go to the next slide, this is the first international exhibition in 2014 at the Aga Khan Museum, which is a museum of Muslim civilization in Canada. And this really emphasised the Middle Eastern aspects of the shipwreck story. Now, it has gone on to be displayed in America, in China. I think it's in Hong Kong at the moment, actually. And while some of the heat has gone out of the discussion around this shipwreck, I believe they're still not quite free of controversy. So let me wrap up by just problematizing the term intact assemblage, which I have been using. So was it an intact assemblage? As we know, there were an estimated 70,000 objects on board when the ship went down, and about 60,000 of those objects were salvaged, meaning about 10,000 were left on the seabed. Then Singapore bought 53,227 objects. So this leaves a gap of about 7,000. This is a list of the objects in Singapore's collection. So where are the other 7,000? Many of you might already know that those 7,000 objects were seized by Indonesian authorities and are now in storage at the BMKT warehouse in Chilungsi. And this is a lovely photo of some Indonesian maritime archaeology and history students looking at the objects in 2021 as part of a short course between University of Sydney and KKP. Now, in 2017, 162 objects turned up in China, and they had been sold by a private owner to a Chinese museum, and they're now on display in Changsha. Finally, the anchor is missing. The hull has been destroyed by looters and teredo worms, and there are still objects in private collections, such as this incredible example showing the Makara sea monster seeming to bite or attack the dhow or the ship. A really beautiful example. So my question with which I'd like to conclude is what we have enough? A mostly intact assemblage that is publicly accessible to scholars and the general public, displayed in a way that not only showcases the aesthetic and art historic qualities of the objects, but also interrogates their provenance and how they came to be in the museum and the ethics around their display. I guess I'll wrap up with asking the question about what the implications are for scholars of orphaned objects, and where is the line for us as researchers in conducting research and sharing this information with the public versus possibly legitimising unethical collecting practices that destroy archaeological and historical context. So I'll leave it there, and I'm very happy to answer any questions. I think there's a photo on the next slide of my book, which can be purchased on Amazon, and actually it's quite expensive. So please wait for the paperback, which will come out in August. And also I do hope that in the future it will be published in Indonesian, so that it will be more accessible for Indonesian friends. Thank you so much for having me today.
Okay, thank you for your really amazing presentation. What a presentation is it? Maybe this is a predecessor of IKEA shipping cargo, maybe? IKEA? Yeah, okay. Yeah, back to the audience. Maybe any questions you can, mungkin bisa raise hand atau bertanya dalam kolom chat. Dan mungkin dari teman-teman di YouTube juga bisa bertanya via kolom chat. Bisa dalam bahasa Indonesia, bahasa Inggris. Dipersilakan, apakah ada pertanyaan? Bapak, Ibu? Ya, Pak Hari Sofyan, dipersilakan. Masih di mute, Pak Hari.
Okay, so thank you so much, Miss Natali, for your very good presentation. I'm sorry because in here is the blackout now, so I using my smartphone. Is the Belitung shipwreck is I think is the most important problem for the Indonesian, because we found the shipwreck in the 1999, around the 1999, and that is after that is a sell to the Singapore. So it's actually the problem is for the economic and the history. So there is a two way. But the economic is for the treasure hunter, and the history for the archaeologists and for us too. But actually my question is there is a connection actually for the Indonesian, for the Belitung shipwreck, because they only pass the Indonesian archipelago. They purpose is not to go to Indonesian, actually pass the Indonesian only. But unfortunately, they sang in the Indonesian territory, so that's the problem actually. So the second way is the people actually from the shipwreck, from the Tang shipwreck. So you mean the shipwreck is from the probably from the Arab, but we know that in the ancient part is there is a connection between India and Arab. So Arab and India have the connection in the west part, and India have the connection with the east part, with the Indonesian and the China. So probably there is a mixing between the Arab people or the India for this for the how to say it, the people in the ship. And my last question is about the regulation. So how do you think about the Indonesian Indonesian and Singapore? Because actually the ship is sank in the Indonesian, but it's sold to the Singapore. So how the Indonesian researcher can doing the research in the Singapore for this one? So thank you so much for your answer.
Okay, yeah. Honestly, I would like to open this session with 3 persons, but here are the 3 questions already. So maybe you can answer first.
Yeah, Harry, thank you very much for attending my presentation. I think I've understood your 3 questions. So the first one was about Indonesia within this story. And, you know, I have called my book Belitung. I have not called my book Tang. And that is a very deliberate decision, because I think in the discussions about Belitung, before I began my research, it was a discussion dominated by 2 dynasties, Tang dynasty, Abbasid Empire. And where was Indonesia in this discussion? Where was Southeast Asia? Southeast Asia is an important part of this so-called maritime Silk Road, but it was lost in the discussions that were being had. And it seemed like just an accident that the shipwreck ended up in Indonesia. Well, Indonesia is an important part of the story. This is a time of the Sriwijaya Empire, of course, but the location of the vessel, it was very far south of Malacca Strait, which was the principal trading route. Some scholars think maybe it was going through the Sunda Strait. I don't agree with that. But, you know, the weight of opinion is that it was stopping somewhere in Nusantara, maybe in Java, for trading before continuing to the Middle East. So Indonesia is actually an important part of this story, which is why I called my book Belitung, in an effort to reclaim Indonesia and to recenter Indonesia into the story. Now, you talked about people and connections between you know, the Middle East and India and Southeast Asia. Of course, there were so many. This was such an interconnected world in the 9th century, and with every shipwreck discovery, we learn more and more about just how interconnected and sophisticated these trading networks were. One thing I didn't mention is that the people on the ship of whom no trace remains. There's no evidence of human remains on the shipwreck. They may well have been local people, and it was probably a crew who spoke many different languages, and brought on board local people, local pilots with expertise in the reefs and the shoals of each area in which they were passing through to help them navigate the ship. So, you know, there's a lot we don't know about who was on board, but it's very likely that it was a polyglot, very mixed crew. Now, finally, regulation. So when the Geldermalsen was discovered in and salvaged in the mid-1980s, this ship, you know, we don't know really if it was in Indonesian territorial waters or Singaporean territorial waters, and it was sold in the Netherlands, and there was permission from the Dutch, but there was no permission from Indonesia because Indonesia did not have any regulation in place, and it was the Geldermalsen that prompted Indonesia and also China to introduce shipwreck legislation in the late 80s. Now, Indonesia's shipwreck legislation has changed a lot since 1989. There was commercial salvage until 2010. Then there was a temporary moratorium, then a permanent moratorium in 2006. Then the Omnibus Law, Cipta Kerja, said, okay, salvage dibolehkan, it can happen again. And now there's a new Perpres this year that has said commercial salvage may be possible only with permission from Ministry of Education and Culture. So it's very hard to keep track of the changes in Indonesian legislation, and it says a lot about how Indonesia values the shipwrecks in its waters and their relevance for Indonesian history. Now, if you are an Indonesian researcher and you want to do research on this shipwreck in Singapore, you can request permission to go and visit it from the National Heritage Board. They do allow researchers to go and do the sort of typology comparative work that I was talking about with the pseudoscript and the calligraphy. It's not very straightforward. It's a little bit difficult, but it is possible to gain access to the objects. And, you know, maritime archaeology in Indonesia has changed a lot since Belitung was discovered. And, you know, I'm really excited to see so many Indonesian archaeologists on the call today. Thank you for your question, Harry. Your 3 questions.
Oke, terima kasih Mas Hari. Sudah cukup jelas. Oke. Yeah, thank you for your information, Natali. Pak Hari is also our maritime archaeology, but now transferring to metallurgy.
Oh, metallurgy. Why are you going to metallurgy? Come back to maritime archaeology, Harry.
Yeah. It's another for another session, but we have another question from Mbak Agni. Yeah, Mbak Agni also our maritime archaeologist.
Hi, Agni. It's so nice to see you.
Silakan Mbak Agni.
Hi, Natalie, how are you?
Nice to see you.
Very nice to see you too, and thank you for the amazing presentation as always. Terima kasih Mas Alqiz. Selamat sore semuanya. Masih pagi di sini. Pak Herry, selamat sore. Pak Marlon juga selamat sore. Okay, so first, I would like to congratulate Natali for the book, and I did notice that you chose the title Belitung, and I really appreciate that. I know it was chosen intentionally, and I'm so happy because that is also like one of my concern following like the story of the Belitung shipwrecks, like how the narrative in Singapore now is kind of like omit all Indonesian connections and everything. So it is really refreshing to kind of like have another perspective from you, and I haven't had a chance to read your book, and so like I'm very look forward to reading it. And one of the things, well, I mean, of course, if it's about Belitung, there are so many things that we can discuss and argue and everything. But for this opportunity, I just want to kind of like add some information regarding the the origin of the ship. So there's quite recent articles, and this is written by a botanist specialist, so not really from archaeologists, but he made a very good suggestions that there is a possibility of errors in the analysis of the species made by Flecker. So he proposed that like the species from the woods were mostly from Southeast Asia. So it's like from one family but different species, but they are like mostly from Southeast Asia. So he proposed that most likely the ship was built somewhere in Southeast Asia, but maybe by the like Western Indian Ocean shipbuilder, or like maybe local builder trained by the Indian or Arab shipbuilder. So it's also very interesting to kind of like, if we come back to Panom Surin, which is like very similar in technology, and also like the raw materials were all like Southeast Asian timber. So this is a very, very interesting new information. Well, I'm looking for the articles in my folders, and I will share it later when I found it. But yeah, this is very interesting also to kind of like maybe kind of like comment to Harry's question. So so what was like the Indonesian, you know, role in this narrative? We don't have a very conclusive result at the moment, but at the time it was difficult to kind of like separate Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, of course, at the time. So I believe the exchange of technology, in this case shipbuilding technology at the time, was very impressive, and even many scholars say that like the ships to bring all the Chinese ceramics, if the original ship came from China, most likely they will change it somewhere in Belitung around Sriwijaya, because like the Chinese timbers, they cannot survive like Southeast Asian waters. So there are like so many kind of like connection, and of course Indonesia and or like the bigger Southeast Asia had a very important role in this kind of network. So maybe I will just want to share that, and like I would love to hear your comment, Natali. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Agni. I so appreciate your question and your expertise. I will have to get that article from you. I'm not aware of the article, but I am aware of other researchers who are trying to gain access to the cordage and the wadding to do more analysis, because they also suspect that the timber analysis was flawed, and that the bulk of the materials are Southeast Asian. And as you said, Southeast Asian materials constructed by shipwrights trained in the Western Indian Ocean techniques. And you know, what a terrible loss it would be if we only talked about this story in terms of Chinese ceramics and the Middle Eastern market, because the more we find out about this shipwreck, the more connection it has to Southeast Asia, both in the past and today. You know, it's still a part of a Southeast Asian story today, including with Thailand, with this sister ship of the Panom Surin. So yeah, please send me the article, Agni, and I'm already collecting information for a second edition of the book. So I'll make sure that I cite that new article. You know, I do talk about the contested timber analysis in the book, and the suggestion that it was built in Malaysia or Sumatra. And you know, some of the criticism of the shipwreck salvage is that if it had been excavated, we would have this information. Now, we can't really know the answer to that. You know, I agree with that in principle, but when it comes to this particular case study, I don't know the answer to that. We do have a lot of information, but there are still many questions that are not answered. And this question of the ship origin is a big one. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. I will send it to you.
Thanks.
Right. Okay, thank you for the question, Mbak Agni. Okay, maybe we still have like 3 minutes for the answering questions sessions. Maybe one more questions from the audience in Zoom and also YouTube. Ada pertanyaan lagi? Oh, silakan dari Bu
Kumarati.
Ya, dipersilakan Ibu untuk bertanya.
Hai.
Hi,
Hello,
so nice to
Natali.
see you.
Terima kasih atas waktunya. Finally, just a short question. I mean, this case provides important lessons for us regarding cultural heritage management, and particularly in maritime cultural heritage. And it's very interesting that how Singapore, in constructing its narrative, is actually associating it with the maritime Silk Route. So I see this case is very full of politics of heritage. But I'd like to ask your opinion about how do you think that, what's your opinion regarding Indonesia's effort to reconstruct its new narrative? I'm sure you have heard that Indonesia is reconstructing the concept of spice route and promoting that, and to be promoted to be World Heritage to UNESCO. And do you think this effort is an opportunity so Indonesian scholars have to play a bigger role in make meaning of this heritage to the Southeast Asian region? That's my question. Thank you.
Morati, thank you so much. Oh, I can hear myself just a minute. Yeah, great question about really about these efforts to decenter the Sino-centric maritime Silk Road narrative that is so romantic and so popular, and it just seems to be gaining popularity, really. This concept of the maritime Silk Road and the Silk Road more broadly across the land. And as you know, your colleague at RE, Tim Winter, has done a lot of work on the revitalization of Silk Road narratives in the Belt and Road Initiative, which is all about these global connectivities and harmonization. And yes, you rightly point out that Indonesia is developing its spice route narrative, and you know, you've done a lot of work in that regard too, and it will be very interesting to see how that goes with UNESCO. And you know, we also see other countries doing something similar. You know, of course, India with its Project Mosam, which is looking at really claiming the winds and the monsoon narrative as part of its efforts within the Indian Ocean. And these, I think what's interesting about these narratives is what they tell us about the claims, about the way heritage is being used and can be used within these broader you know, international relations conversations. The idea of you know, of geoculture, as Tim puts it, this the way that heritage is being used. So I think, you know, regardless of you know, where the spice route goes or where Project Mosam goes, and I of course wish Indonesia Beruntung, the best of luck with spice route. The question of the broader politics of heritage is a really important one that I think we should not lose sight of, even as we're focusing on questions of silk and spice and monsoon. What's driving it? What's behind it? What change is it going to affect? Thank you, Kumarati. Let's talk about it more when I come to Singapore.
Sure. Thanks, Natali.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Bu Kumarati. Ya, demikian mungkin kita sudahi dulu sesi tanya jawab. Thank you Bu Natali atas presentasinya. What an amazing presentation you have. And before we close this lecture, maybe we have a conclusion from our head of research center, Pak Marlon. And ya, saya akan memberikan waktu dan tempat kepada Pak Marlon untuk memberikan semacam kesimpulan dan penutup dari kegiatan ini. Tempat dan waktu untuk Pak Marlon dipersilakan.
Terima kasih Mas Alqiz untuk kesempatan yang diberikan. Well, I think if you mentioned that I have to share conclusion, then I think it's a little bit more than what I should share. But first, I think I would like to say very high appreciation for Natali that shared her time to visit our research institution here and share a very valuable regarding the Belitung shipwreck with us. I'm sure that everyone here, we have a really new perspective, not only regarding the issue of shipwreck, but I think more general in a broader aspect as well, particularly regarding how heritage so very macro impact, I think, regarding everything, not only from the Indonesian perspective, but also related to other countries as well. So I think the main point has been presented by Natali, as what Agni also said, that Natali chose intentionally to have the title of the book, The Belitung and Natang, as we know for years. And I think for those who have interest regarding the cultural heritage in Indonesia, we really appreciate this kind attention. And of course, we hope that this is not the last time that we meet and collaborate, because before this meeting, we also have a conversation with Pak Herry, and I think there is a lot of possibilities that we can work together in the future. And we hope that this could be a good beginning for Natali and also for both of the institutions. So once again, I would like to say terima kasih banyak and thank you very much for your visit here. And I'm sure that everyone really enjoy your presentation. And I think that's all about this. Thank you.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Marlon atas closing remarks-nya, penutupnya dalam kegiatan kali ini. Dan kebetulan panitia memberikan saya informasi, the crew told me that as appreciation for your insightful lecture and sharing knowledge, we would like to give some souvenirs. And Pak Herry mohon izin untuk memberikan, mungkin di depan ya bersama, agar bisa difoto bersama ya di depan mungkin ya. You can, okay. Dan untuk peserta yang sudah hadir di dalam ruang Zoom dan YouTube, diharap mengisi daftar hadir yang sudah disediakan. Maybe we can take a picture together with the participants. Ya, Bapak Ibu sekalian yang hadir di ruang Zoom, dipersilakan menyalakan kameranya. Kita akan berfoto bersama. Bapak Ibu. Oke. Ya. Dipersilakan Bapak Ibu. Ya. Silakan dinyalakan kameranya, kita akan berfoto bersama. Kebetulan saya moderator sekaligus juru foto. Oh ya. Ya, baik Bapak Ibu sekalian, terima kasih telah mengikuti kegiatan diskusi terkait yang berjudul yang berjudul The Afterlives of a Shipwreck yang dibawakan oleh Ibu Natali yang sangat baik sekali. Terima kasih Ibu Natali telah hadir bersama dengan kita. Terima kasih juga Pak Herry, Pak Marlon yang telah mendampingi kami semua dalam kegiatan ini. Lebih kurangnya mohon maaf, saya selaku moderator dari kegiatan ini menutup acara ini dengan alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. Ya, dengan demikian berakhir acara ini, lebih kurangnya mohon maaf. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat sore, shalom, namo buddhaya, om swastiastu, dan salam kebajikan.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih.